Have it casted, or somebody can read it for us. Yes.
So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and the female created he them.
So God created man in the image of God. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And I wanted to look at the emphasis done on the word image in verse 27. In verse 26, God said, "Let us create man in our image." And at this point, he changes the formula because he says, "Let us." And the question I have is whether, as he makes that statement, is he doing the creation or he's actually planning? As opposed to, we have seen a pattern of God said, "Let there be," and it was. Such that the word follows the being instantly. So my question is, when God says, "Let us," is the creation of man underway? Or is it future to that statement? What do you think? It's future. And that one now emphasizes the idea of how profound the issue of image is to God. And whoever is making the statement in the words of Moses, because Moses uses the word Elohim. The word Elohim precedes that statement. And you might have noted that Elohim stands for or means greatness, the plural of greatness. Some other places where the Bible uses the same word is in Exodus 7, talking of Moses, how he was to be to Pharaoh. And later, it is witnessed that the man Moses was exceedingly great before Pharaoh. So, one who has exceeding majesty says, "Let us." And that is in the planning. And now the issue of image, it's so important that God says he has to rule or to have dominion over the fish of the earth, the birds of the air, the earth, and everything that creepeth. And then we have emphasis in verse 27 that God created man in his image. Male and female created he them. So what we are saying here is that as opposed to verse 26, which talks of man comprising of male and female, God specifies the individuality of male and female in verse 27. So these two were to have what we call dominion over. So the woman was not placed secondary in matters of dominion. She had a mind, an individuality, and she was to bear or she was to have dominion in the same strength Adam was to have. So now that we shall be talking about mind and character, we'll be looking at how God intends to have control and to shape our mind in such a way that it can fit into his image. So if you go to Genesis 2, verse 7, we are reminded again that God formed man out of the dust of the earth. And at that position, at that point, we have the likeness. The shape has been formed, but he is yet to attain the image of God. God breathes into him the breath of life, and after breathing into him the breath of life, he starts to have what we call the very first involuntary functions. So he is able to see, he is able to move his hands, he is able to walk, he can stand. Involuntary functions. And he has to use those functions to develop a character after God's own character. So it matters what he does with those functions. So if he humbles himself before God and praises him, he is forming the first attributes of worship of a superior being, a being superior to him. And God would say that he's forming a personality after his own personality. And that is what God had intended. But you see, all this will be a function of the mind. He chooses to do that. So what we see in the creation of man after God's own image, he is giving him a choice. It is different from the other animals he created because they are going to be under the dominion of man, and therefore they will be merging or fitting their individuality into that of Adam. So Adam will be judging, the name will be judging or will be determining where to place these animals. He will also be determining what names to be called to these animals. They do not have a choice of their own. They are going to fit into Adam's decisions. And therefore, we do not talk of animals as having a personality because there is no choice. They are under the dominion of man. It is not so to Eve, who came out of Adam. The Bible says he created them in his own image, male, specifically the male gender, and the female created he them in his image. So there is no way the individuality of Eve can be merged with that of Adam. They are two distinct persons here, and they have two distinct minds. And how they determine to do with that mind now describes or defines their character. I'll give you an example. If Adam rose up and used the function of the mouth, one of which is to eat, and before he eats, he bows down to thank God for that food, then he bears the personality of God. And that is worship. He is worshiping God in eating. As opposed to a monkey, when it eats, it's not worshiping God. It is fulfilling the desires and functions of its own physiology, of its own body. So you may comfortably say that by eating in a manner that worships God, Adam is worshiping. But for a monkey, it's eating It's fulfilling a physiological demand. That's the difference. Then you can say Adam has a mind designed after God's own personality, but it's not so with the monkey. The challenge we have here with the mind is because the devil intends to create a personality of him in your own mind. But God's design is that we may shape our minds to imitate his personality. Now, if you read for me 2 Corinthians 2, chapter 10, verse 10, we get the following. Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. Now let's go to where we have 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4.
But we serve not carnal, but
Yes.
the mind, pulling down of stronghold,
Yeah, continue.
casting down imagination and every high thing that is itself against the knowledge of God, the bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
Yeah, thank you. So, the devil intends to build strongholds in our minds. But the work of God is to bring down, to cast down those imaginations so that they may all be subdued to obey Christ. So at one juncture, when Eve is wandering towards the tree of knowledge of good and evil, she's using a function of the limbs to walk towards. And then she sees the tree. And then she hears a voice. And when she hears a voice, she looks, uses the function of the eye, to look at where the voice is coming from. And she sees a splendid figure. And she is surprised. And do you know what part of the mind is being stimulated? It's the baser passions. It's the limbic system. It's the pleasure area. She looks at the organism that is speaking and she gets attracted to it, feels the desire to listen to the organism more and more. And then when she listens to the words, she hears promises of achievement. And she desires to have such an achievement. And temptation now is building up to pick of that fruit. Now, what we find is that at this point, she does not reason because the mind, being this area, the frontal lobe, is the seat of judgment. So she does not pause to judge. Now, the problem with the baser passions, or the part of the brain below the seat of judgment, it's a pleasure area. It can be pleased. And there is contentment and enjoyment as that area is being stimulated. So it masked her ability to reason. And for the very first time in the history of the creation of mankind, the devil had initiated something we call mind control. So the devil did not start, may I put it this way? The devil had a plan of destruction of the world. But for this plan to succeed, he had to control the mind. And therefore, in the temptation of Eve, that was the very first instance of mind control. That is Eve surrendering her mind to another. But the creation of Adam and Eve was so specific that both were created with their own individuality. So for once, we can see a person created in the image of God with a mind and a personality, surrendering it or merging it into another being. So the very instance of mind control. So when Paul writes about subduing the mind so that it obeys Christ, he is sensitive of how the devil works. Because in order to destroy the body, the earth, he has to control the mind. He has to disseminate an ideology that is attractive. And that becomes the starting point of destruction of the earth, of the body, and everything about it. I had asked somebody if this would be possible, if you can project, if you can, the image of the brain so that we can see the anatomy, if that is possible. Okay. Now, this is what I'm talking about. When we talk of the mind, I think that is the best definition we can get in terms of resolution. Now, you look at the part that is superior, okay? Yes, let's not use this one. Let's use the one with, okay, let's use this one. Now, the sections you see, the purple section is what we call the frontal lobe. It's a seat of judgment. It is where you reason and you decide. It is also the seat that defines your personality. That's the purple area. Now, when you go to the one that has greenish, I don't know, you see, I don't know whether I can define color properly, but the green area is also, it's around this area, okay? So you have, that is called the sensory area, meaning all the senses that you have are integrated in that area. So that is where if you touch something, especially anything that has to do with the skin, all those senses are interpreted in that area. And then we have this part, which we call the back of your head. It's where we have the vision area, okay? So your vision is interpreted at the back of your head. And then here, okay, where you see the yellow area, we have your hearing area, okay? Now, the whole of that, minus the section that is below there, because the section that is below there determines your balance or your awareness of space. But the whole of all those areas is what we call the cerebral hemisphere. And there are two cerebral hemispheres. So if we had a front of view, you would see there was a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. And your two hemispheres are sitting on a stem, a single seat like this. Okay? A stem. It's called the brain stem. So the two hemispheres, because they are divided in the middle, work in such a way that the left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. And then here I ask a question. In terms of dominance, which hemisphere is dominant? The left or the right? Is the left, eh? Now I want us to read Mark 12, verse. Am I going to miss the verse? Is it 32, where God says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit on my right side. That's Mark 12, verse 30. Is it 40? Try Mark 12, verse 40. Mark 12, verse 40.
No, not 12, 14 now.
Is it? I'm missing the verse, but it's a very important verse in this. Huh? Yeah, verse 36. Okay.
It says, for David himself said,
Mm.
by the Holy Ghost,
Yes.
the Lord said to my Lord,
Mhm.
sit thou on my right hand till I make thine enemies thy footstool.
Mhm. So it is God who said to Jesus, sit on my right side. And I want to call somebody so that we can illustrate this. Just come. So we will stand, but you can assume we are sitting. Now, he is sitting on my right side. Okay? Whom do you think I am? I represent the Father. He represents Christ. So he is sitting on my right side. Now, let me ask you, which is the dominant hand of the Father? Are we together? Somebody is sitting next to you on your right side. I represent the Father, which is my dominant hand. Which hand can function easily or freely? It's my left. Which hand can function freely with the Son? The right hand, isn't it? Who is superior to the other? Who is greater than the other? Huh?
Using the right hand.
John 14, verse 28. Who is greater than the other? The Father, okay? Now, when it comes to the brain, you might think the left side of the brain, because it's left, it's inferior. But wait until you see when it functions. Because the communication crosses. You've ever heard of God's crossed hands? When Jacob was blessing the sons of Joseph, he did what? He crossed the hands. So that the one who was thought to be the firstborn, okay, got the left hand, and the younger got the right hand. Now, the left side of the brain, becomes dominant when it comes to function, because the communication crosses at some point near your neck. Okay? And then we have the left doing what? Dominating. And the right taking the position of inferiority, because the right hand or the right side of the body is dominant when it comes to the function. So let's go back to the image. So the two are sitting on a single stem. And I imagine this to be the Father and the Son sitting on one throne, because they share the throne. Okay? And then surrounding that brain, we have a very clear, crystal clear sort of water that flows in and out. It goes around the brain and down into the brainstem. Very clear fluid. And which, when if it becomes unclear, there is indication of disease. There are some facts about the brain that once we learn or once we discover them, it gives us an aspect of how God may have designed this area to be an illustration of the most protected, the cleanest, and the highest area in terms of superiority and also judgment. So God places the head above. And you know, man was created upright. We did not start as quadrupeds, people who are walking on fours, and then at some point we became Homo erectus, so we stood on our feet. From the beginning, we were created upright. And the brain was placed highest on the body because it was supposed to dominate the rest of the body. So, by design, by structure, we have an example of an organ that should be superior to all the other organs. And now when you read Colossians 2, verse 9, what does it tell us? What does it tell us? What position do you give the brain in the human body? Colossians 2, verse 9, what does it say?
Say, for in him dwelleth all the fullness of
Sorry. It's 2, verse 19.
Colossians 2, verse 19.
Mm.
And not holding the head, from which all the body by joints and bands, having nourishment, minister, and knit together, increaseth with the increase of God. Colossians 2, verse 19.
Exactly. Okay? So we have the entire body bound to the brain. It's connected to the head. Here, the head simply means the brain and its function. So I want you to imagine that the entire body is connected to the brain. Now, how many millions and billions of cells does the rest of the body have? And consider that the brain communicates with each and every cell in the rest of the body. Now, this must be a very sophisticated, complex structure that could be extremely difficult to understand. Because even science cannot study the brain effectively. And the reason is, to start with, it is unethical to study a human being when he is alive. Because you see, cells and tissues change after death. But they have managed during operations to open the brain and maybe touch certain parts of the brain, and they have discovered that when you touch a certain part of the brain, there's a certain part of the body that is responding. So if you touch the area where we have the motor functions of the limb can kick. And if you touch the area where we have the motor functions of the hand can move. So there's a map of the entire body in the brain. But this must be very many brain cells to be able to cover, to be able to represent the entire body in it. So this is how complex it is, and this is how wonderful our Creator is in designing the human brain. So there's a lot we may not discuss because we do not want to lose the objective of today's study. Here, I may list some certain facts we need to know about the brain, the human brain. Number one, it is the most guarded internal organ in the body. And here, we do not need a lot of science to understand. Because if you look at your body, the importance of an organ is determined by the structure of the bones covering that organ. It's only in the brain where all the bones covering that organ are fused and there's no inlet apart from the inlet of blood vessels and the nerves. So it's only in the brain you find the entire bone is fused. And as you move away from the brain, God creates distance between the bones. Because the organs in the chest are also equally important, but you see the bones have a space between each other. And as you move away from the chest, then you find in your abdomen is exposed. It does not have a covering of bones. So it's the most guarded. In terms of that is physical barrier. But also in terms of infections, the brain is also guarded because there's something that prevents infections from getting into the brain. It is called the BBB. It is called the blood-brain barrier. So this would mean that the brain does not take blood as the other organs take. The blood that goes to the brain has to be filtered. It does not supply the brain directly. And this is a special aspect of this organ. So this is meant to filter infections and any chemical that might get into the brain. Now, the other thing we find about the brain is that it consumes the most energy. It consumes the most energy. It's the organ that consumes the most energy. And energy in terms of oxygen and also glucose. It consumes a lot of oxygen. It also consumes a lot of glucose. But there is no store for these elements in the brain. The brain does not have extra space for these elements. And therefore, you have to constantly supply them. So this would mean a moment of deficiency of oxygen will lead you to collapse. The same applies to glucose. It has to use these elements constantly, and there should be no deficiency. The brain will only give you an allowance of less than 3 minutes to deprive it of oxygen, and then you collapse. And the other problem is, if it collapses and you get to that juncture of what we call brain death, it cannot be revived, even if you are to resupply the oxygen. Okay? So the same applies to, and this can tell us how we should take seriously things to do with breathing effectively to ensure that your brain has adequate oxygen. Because unless we have enough of this, then we tend to be sluggish, the mind tends to be foggy, and not to be able to understand. So this would mean if somebody learns the techniques of good breathing, then you are not only supporting your brain health, but you're also increasing the ability to understand and to memorize and to sustain what you have learned. Techniques of good breathing. And you know, God breathed the breath of life through the nostrils. So this will mean the best form of breathing is breathing through the nostrils. So if you want to know people who do not know how to breathe, they breathe with their mouth instead of using the nostrils. And because we have a lot we can learn from babies, I want you to look at babies when they are breathing and see how air moves. See how